I've talked about IRAC with a full analysis with many of you. However, I think it's an extremely useful tool, so I'm recording this short video about it. It's useful for a couple of reasons. One, if you're a very quick thinker and need to train yourself to slow down, employing this particularly deliberately at first, but employing an IRAC with a full analysis will put you in a good position to address that speed issue. For those who are told that their writing is too conclusory, IRAC with a full analysis is similarly a great idea because this more or less forces you into conducting a thorough analysis. And it's that kind of analysis that you want to present to your professor in the exam answer, and that's the kind of answer that you get with an IRAC with a full analysis. In this video, I'll just tell you how it works. In a separate video that I'll record later this week, I think, I'll do an example of it working. I think you'll appreciate just from its description how it works, but it sometimes helps to see it in motion, so I'll do that later in the week. Just to review, exam writing format is IRAC, issue, rule, analysis, conclusion. Unless your professor prefers something else, this is the general structure you should use. And in law, we do rule-based reasoning. I think you know this already, but sometimes it's good to touch on fundamentals. You may appreciate them differently when you hear them again now, after having gone through a semester and a half of law school and exams once. You have a different appreciation of some of those basic things. And one of those basic things is that law, as a rule-based reasoning system, applies the language of a rule to a set of facts to predict an outcome or to discuss what should be the outcome. And it's used on exams in both issue spotting and IRAC type problems. So this is a general approach to law. So I'll say just a couple of things about each of the sections, though I will concentrate on the analysis section. Issues, as you've learned elsewhere, arrive at the interface or the interaction between facts and law. Specifically, the laws will be in the form of rules to create, and that's how issues arise. I won't say more about issues here, but if you'd like to hear more about issues, watch that issue spotting lecture that is up on Blackboard now. I'd like to raise a particular value of the issue statement, and this is with regards to exam answers. Your recitation of the issue will implicate which set of rules to utilize in your answer. And this may seem like a truism, but think about it for a second. Once you identify, either through the call of the question or through an issue spotting analysis, what the issue is, then a certain set of rules will immediately be implicated. You can narrow your analysis to those rules. Sometimes those rules build on each other, like in contracts, for example, some instances in contracts particularly. And in other places, they can stand independently. Nevertheless, your recitation of the issue implicates those rules on which you will rely in your answer. Those rules, in turn, implicate your answer structure. You're, in essence, answering the question based on the rules, what must be proved or proven to establish a legal proposition. And that is at a very high level exactly what you're doing in an IRAC. You're evaluating whether or not what needs to be proved. In other words, what elements of a rule need to be established, and whether the facts present in this question establish that legal proposition. For example, if you're looking at whether a particular property, let's just call it Whiteacre, is a joint tenancy or a tenancy in common, you have to go through those rules which will establish what kind of tenancy that property is. And that's the legal proposition. So I suggest that you treat each sub-issue to its own IRAC. And that I will address in another lecture entitled Umbrella IRACs. And more details about that sub-issue gets its own IRAC are going to be found in that lecture. But getting back to the nuts and bolts of the analysis, this is what rule-based reasoning looks like. There's a component, and you can think of those as elements of your rule. Facts that you're going to identify from the question will be presented by yourself in your answer. You'll present your understanding of the legal relevance of that fact, and then you determine whether or not element A, B, C, and D are present. And that's the analysis that you can conduct, or that you do conduct on an exam. Just, reduced to its bare components. So if you think of it in this broad way of identifying a component, assessing whether or not facts through your understanding of the fact and its legal relevance permit you to reach a conclusion regarding the presence or absence of that element. That's just a long-winded way of saying IRAC and the analysis that goes into an IRAC. Because out of all this analysis, and whether the elements are met, you can reach the conclusion, the legally relevant conclusion about whether a contract was formed, about what type of tenancy a property is. Those are the kinds of legal conclusions that you can reach. Here's where we get to the bulk of the lecture today. It's on the analysis component of IRACs. And we call this writing an IRAC with a full analysis. And the FUL stand for fact, understanding of the fact, and linking facts to the language of the rule. So if you undertake this kind of analysis, which I'll describe in greater detail in the next couple of moments, you will necessarily slow down. And if you undertake this type of analysis, your analysis will not be conclusory. So if you are receiving those kinds of feedback, then pay particular attention to not only the whole lecture, but this slide. So, of course, the fact is which fact from the question relates to the component of the rule, or the rule element. If a fact does not relate to that component of the rule, then you should question why you're including it. You won't get points for reciting historical facts back to your professor. You get points for conducting a thorough analysis. So the facts that you use to conduct that analysis are the important facts. And specifically in the context of a full analysis, you're identifying those facts from the question's fact pattern that relate to a particular rule or element of a rule, component of a rule. Next, you should share your understanding of the fact, if it's necessary. If it is a signature requirement, for example, and the individual signed something, then there's not much explanation that needs to occur there. If, on the other hand, you are interpreting a fact to mean something else that's legally relevant, you should explain that. Here's a very basic example. Imagine you have an assault question and someone was nearly struck by an errantly or deliberately thrown football, and she winces just before it nearly struck her. So you could say in an answer, well, the plaintiff wins, therefore there was assault. That's conclusory, because wincing isn't an element of assault. As trivial as this example is, I think you can use it to understand my larger point, which, just as in that instance, you should explain that wincing evidences an anticipation of harmful or offensive contact, then you have to explain that inference. You have to state your assumptions. You have to state your understandings that impact your interpretation of that fact and impact your ability to link that fact to the element of the rule, the component. And that's the final step, is linking those facts to the language of the rule. And use the language of the rule. Use the actual language of the rule in your analysis, because it shows that you understand that rule element is an important component of this analysis, that I have to satisfy it, and using the same language helps reinforce that point. But you have to link back to the rule, explaining why the facts make it more or less likely that a component will be met. You present the evidence and you make a conclusion based on that evidence through presenting your understanding of those facts and linking them to the language of the rule. Here is a chart, and again, this is a common theme, right? Where you do things very deliberately the first time you see them, and then soon after that, if not immediately after that, you'll get the idea and can do it with greater ease. But this is the kind of chart that through which you can train yourself to conduct a full analysis. This isn't going to be your IRAC. This is just the analytical part of the IRAC. And this is set up for the example that I'll do in the other lecture. But there's an intent to be bound in that case. So would a reasonable person believe that the offeror intended to be bound? So there are certain facts from the pattern that you can talk about, and you can share an understanding of your fact and identify the link and result. So if you set this up and conduct this kind of analysis very deliberately, you can use the chart, you can not use the chart. You can do it in your head. As long as you do it deliberately the first couple of times, you will start to learn that as a skill. And it is just that. It's a skill where you have to force yourself to walk slowly through these issues. The more you do that and do it deliberately and engage those facts in a very, not quite formulaic, but almost formulaic, structured way, you're going to be in a much better position. You're going to feel more comfortable. Some of that exam anxiety is going to go. There's all sorts of benefits to having a structure and a regimen that you use on an exam. A full analysis is a big part of that, because whenever you're rushing on an exam, you still have to do this. You're rushing to get the most points that you can. And you can do this very efficiently. Imagine back to the assault example. That could be done in a sentence, but it still needs to be done. And now we reach the conclusion, just to say a couple of things about it. you're providing the answer to your issue statement. And be sure, here's something that I always did. Be sure your conclusion addresses the call of the question, which is, are you answering what the question asked you to answer? Sometimes when you're in the middle of analysis, certain things are implicated and you just roll with that. It's best to come back and ground yourself in the question from time to time. Make sure that you are addressing exactly what the question is asking for, because that's the easiest way, of course, of getting points on your exam.